Welcome to part 1 of chapter 3 of our series trying to answer the question, are we heading to a dystopian future? In this chapter, we will look deeply into the novel Brave New World by Aldus Huxley. In this part, I will provide the foundations required to understand the second part, discussing the societal and sociopolitical characteristics depicted in this novel. Now, if you haven't read the novel, this would be a great time to give a thumbs up because I did it for you. If you have, this would be the perfect time to share it with someone who hasn't. And while there are a few spoilers, if you find this book intriguing, feel free to use the link in the description to Amazon or Audible to buy the book and support my work. And now, let's start with the overview. Introduction. Brave New World is a dystopian novel published in 1932 and authored by Aldous Huxley, who was either a philosopher masquerading as an author or the other way around. Frighteningly enough, Huxley's Dystopian Future is a pretty accurate description of our present Western civilization. A machine made of consumerist, hedonistic, echo-chambered individuals conditioned by the machine to feed the machine. Okay, I'm exaggerating. It's not that accurate of a description, but damn does Brave New World come close. Although, to be fair to our modern Western civilization, the machine Huxley describes is a totalitarian technocracy called the World Economic Forum. I meant to say the World State, that drugs and conditions its citizenry to achieve a single goal: maximize economic growth and humans be damned. You know what? On second thought, maybe I'm not exaggerating that much. Okay, but now let me be serious for a bit. The world state's government and the body politic follow a sociopolitical ideology called Fordism, named after Henry Ford, the inventor of the assembly line and modern mass production. This alone should already give you an idea of what this society is like: a clockwork of controlled and mechanistic individuals that function like a giant factory within a corporate-like structure. Accordingly, the society in the world state as a whole, including the ruling or managerial class, is modeled after the hierarchy in a mass-producing assembly line factory. However, unlike a standard corporate factory, humans in the world state are both the workers and the product, made to the specifications deemed necessary by the government to both produce and consume, an exaggeration of both conservative and postmodern critique of liberal capitalism. Like the workforce of an assembly line, society has to be stable, synchronized, and highly structured, with each worker having a well-defined role from which they cannot deviate. To achieve this, the world state instills stringent social norms to control reproduction, emotions, and social relationships. However, rather than being forced to comply with the system under which they live, citizens of the world state are biologically engineered, psychologically conditioned, and drugged to be content in their predetermined lives and jobs that perpetuate the system. Amongst its means of control, the world state employs the following. 1. Strict stratification of society through biological engineering and industrial breeding. 2. Brainwashing and conditioning using Pavlovian training and sleep teaching, better known as hypnopedia. 3. Using immersive media that bombards the senses as a distraction and a means to push propaganda. 4. The world state also administers a psychiatric drug called soma to pacify the population. 5. Promoting promiscuity to prevent love-based social bonds. 6. Ingraining a moral ideology that encourages citizens to punish nonconformity. The strict stratification of society, which is a central theme of the book, takes the form of 5 castes divided by intelligence and physical characteristics. The alphas at the top are a ruling class of sorts, akin to social elites and high-level bureaucrats in our world. Under them are the betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons, with all 5 castes engineered and conditioned for their predetermined roles. An additional class division, minus and plus, breaks each caste into 2 layers. For instance, alpha plus versus alpha minus, creating an internal hierarchy within each caste. Other than the 5 castes that make up the body politic of the world state, the world is also inhabited by savages who live in savage reservations, access to which is strictly controlled. Citizens of the world state cannot visit the reservations without permission, and visits are usually reserved for psychological research. Unlike citizens of the world state, the savages suffer from old age, disease, strife, and unhappiness, all of which have been cured in the world state. Savages also have standard familial structures as well as religious beliefs based on the divine and supernatural. This is in contrast to their counterparts in the world state that live a family-free, communal life in constant pursuit of gratification and physical pleasure. Since the world state citizens are free of the suffering that naturally inflicts humans, and because they are happy in their existence, the world state is an anti-utopia rather than a dystopia, meaning that while seemingly utopian, once you scratch the surface, a dystopian society is uncovered, which is precisely what the book attempts to do. Synopsis. While many aspects of the world state are evidently horrific without further dwelling, Huxley attempts to fully expose the world state for what it is in all its facets, especially the type of society that it creates. To that end, Huxley follows the social awakening of Bernard Marx, an alpha plus, or a top-level bureaucrat, if you wish. In the novel, Bernard becomes disillusioned with the world state and begins questioning its values and his happiness. Another character who goes through a similar process is his friend and colleague Helmholtz Watson. Both characters work in fields that engineer citizens' psychology. Bernard is a psychologist specializing in hypnopedia, i.e., indoctrination during sleep, and Helmholtz Watson works in the department of writing as an emotional engineer. However, there are a few interesting contrasts between these 2 alpha pluses. Bernard Marx is disliked by his peers and described as ugly and small, a smallness that one of the characters describes as typically low caste. In fact, there's a rumor that he's actually a gamma who ended up as an alpha by mistake. On the other hand, his friend and colleague Helmholtz is widely admired by both the women around him and his superiors. In contrast to the small and ugly Bernard, the book describes Helmholtz as follows: a powerfully built man, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcible, empathic way, he was handsome and looked, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimeter an alpha plus. End quote. As a result, the most notable difference between the two is what primes them to question the society in which they live. In both cases, it is a sense of separateness from the rest, but the reasons are starkly different in both men. Bernard is conscious of being different due to his physical inadequacy as an alpha. On the other hand, Helmholtz is made aware of his distinction due to his mental excess. In other words, Bernard sees himself as separate from society because he's not as good as the rest, while Helmholtz sees himself as separate because he's better. While the main characters seem at first to be Bernard and Helmholtz, and to an extent Bernard's love interest, Lenina, the main plot point in the book revolves around Bernard's introduction to and interactions with John the Savage. After meeting John the Savage in a reservation, Bernard brings John back with him to the world state, where he introduces him to the ways of this seemingly utopian society. Through his interactions with John the Savage, the story of how he ended up in a reservation, and John's reactions to the morals and norms of the world state, Bernard begins to see society's flaws and limitations and questions the government's principles. As Bernard becomes increasingly disillusioned and exposes the hypocrisy of world controllers, which are like the top-level executives in that world, he becomes a threat to the government. As consequence, Bernard and Helmholtz are exiled by the world state for their transgressions. Once Bernard and Helmholtz depart the scene, the book focuses entirely on John the Savage. John cannot find his place in society and eventually ends his own life, secluded from citizens of the world state who see him as nothing more than a curiosity. And with that, I think you have enough of a background to enjoy the next part, where we'll explore the societal and socio-political characteristics depicted in Huxley's Brave New World. And remember, don't do to others what is hurtful to you. Don't let the bad guys win, and feel free to use the links below to support my work. And of course, thank you for staying to the end.